Hello, everybody. We'll get started in just a second here. Like everyone's ready. Thanks everybody so much for joining us today. We'd first like to recognize that this event is being hosted on the unceded and unsurrendered ancestral and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. My name is Christen. I'm a graduate from the UBC MLA program. I'm a current BCSLA intern, and I work at LEES+Associates, which is a landscape architecture firm based in Vancouver. Most of my work there involves the design and planning of cemeteries across Western Canada and beyond. My colleague Noora and I have put this event together as a bit of a passion project, which builds upon a graduate level studio course that we delivered at UBC's SALA, hoping to generate a meaningful discussion here today about how we can design landscapes of grief and remembrance, especially while working with marginalized communities. Noora, did you want to just briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Kristen. Hi, everyone. My name is Noora. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. Similarly to my colleague Kristen, I'm an alumnus of UBC's Master of Landscape Architecture program and a BCSLA intern working as a landscape designer at LEES+Associates, sitting between our practice areas in cemetery design as well as parks, recreation, and trails planning. And additionally having opportunities to serve as a sessional instructor at UBC Sala. I'll leave my introduction at that, but I'm very much looking forward to seeing how today's conversation unfolds.
Thanks, Noora. Today, we're going to be hearing from our panelists, who are Jackie Bowring, Diane Allen, and Lila Zeppelin. So these are three landscape designers and architects whose work, experiences, and perspectives have afforded them some really unique insights into the design of sacred landscapes. In the interest of time, we're going to let them introduce themselves more fully during their short presentations, which will orient us to their work. And then our MC, Katie Houston, will facilitate a panel discussion, which will run until 3:30 Pacific time, so that'll be about an hour. After a short break, then we'll have about an hour for audience Q&A. So we're really looking forward to everyone's participation in that. And just a note that this meeting is being recorded, so it's going to be posted on Eventbrite after the event. So thanks again, everybody, for being here. I'm going to introduce Katie, and then with that, we'll get started. So Katie, who is our MC today, works at Return Home, which is a Washington-based death care service provider that specializes in terramation, also known as human composting, where human remains are turned into soil. Katie's role at Return Home involves supporting families during their time of need, creating personalized, memorable experiences that honor each unique life. She ensures that each decedent's terramation journey is completed with love and care, and she leads Return Home's educational outreach efforts within the funeral industry. Katie is a licensed funeral director and embalmer in both Washington and her home country of England, as well as a certified celebrant and board member of the Washington State Funeral Directors Association. With over a decade in traditional funeral service, Katie sought a path that aligned with her values, and Return Home provided her the opportunity to steward the earth while guiding families in a more meaningful way. Free from the pressures of sales, Katie offers families the space to create rituals that resonate deeply, allowing her to build genuine connections throughout the 60-day terramation process. This work gives Katie the purpose to continue supporting people in their most difficult moments. Since joining Return Home, Katie has flourished in reconnecting families with their death experience and encouraging meaningful family participation. Return Home's culture has empowered her to fully embrace her skills and encouraged her to explore new talents. Outside of work, Katie enjoys life with her dog, Dixie Barbara, tending to her vegetable garden, advocating for causes she's passionate about, exploring the Pacific Northwest with her two nephews, and devouring as many books as she can. She says, I'm passionate about equal and easy access for everyone to quality, approachable death care and education. Knowing you can make your last act on earth one that heals is empowering. So we're very excited to have her here with us today for both her stellar facilitation skills as well as her perspectives from the death care industry. And with that, I will let you take it away, Katie.
Thank you so much for having me. This is set to be a great conversation, I believe. Our first presentation is going to be, I believe, by Jackie. I am handing over to you.
Great, thank you, Katie. I'm going to share my screen just to get underway. Hopefully that's working. Right, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings, everyone. So I'm Jackie Bowring. I'm based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm a kind of academic landscape architect. So I practice and also research in a wide range of different topics, but the area of memorials and cemeteries is a particular passion of mine. So really grateful to be involved today and talk about some of my experiences, and hopefully that might be of interest. As you can see from the title here, my focus is on design thinking and where that gets us to in terms of thinking about empathizing as kind of fundamental.
Excuse me, Jackie. Sorry, we can't actually see your slides at the moment. Can you just try resharing your screen?
Okay.
There we go. Excellent. Thanks.
Okay, right. Cool. Sorry about that. So let me just go on to my second slide. Yeah. So landscape architects have for decades, centuries even, tended to be very site focused in terms of developing design responses. So the so-called STAD or survey analysis and design process is site driven. It follows a very linear scientific model, and people are only involved in the sense of what Tom Turner refers to as an awareness of the client's functional requirements. So in contrast, the evolution of user-centered design more broadly in the past few decades in disciplines like software and industrial design has provided a model which places the emphasis on people. And there are many versions of the design thinking diagram that we see here, but in general, it's a process that begins with this phase of empathizing with users. This in turn flows on to defining the problem from that perspective, developing ideas, prototyping and testing them with the many feedback loops along the way. So these two approaches can be seen as complementary for landscape architecture, and particularly for the sacred landscapes that we're focusing on today. So I've just attached the survey and analysis part into the diagram because there is a need to develop a deep understanding of the site and also to empathise. But the phase of empathizing can be very fraught in the context of sacred landscapes, and I'm going to focus on a couple of examples of the challenges of empathizing in this setting. Both of the sites are memorial design projects on the sites of disasters, and both have human remains involved, which intensifies the sacredness of the sites. First, the Pike River mine disaster in 2010 saw the loss of 29 men. The bodies remain in the mine, and the mine remains a crime scene. The disaster happened just on the other side of the island to where I live in Christchurch, here in the South Island of New Zealand. And the men were not all miners. Some were builders and other tradesmen working underground. So it's a real kind of slice of a workday environment. I was invited to be involved as the landscape architect and memorials advisor, and together with architects and an interpretation designer, we began a co-design process following the design thinking model with workshops at every phase. We worked alongside the men's families, local Māori, and the Department of Conservation. It was a challenging process because of the demands on family members who were already grappling not just with the trauma of the event, But with the ongoing political situation regarding the mine, with various governments making, then breaking promises about retrieving the men from the mine, as well as the police case. But we were lucky to have a core group of family members who worked alongside us. Timing was challenging. When is it too early and when is it too late to begin empathising? Our first workshops were in 2018, which was 8 years after the disaster, and that's how long it took for a process to evolve. Alongside the empathising and workshops, we were able to use a number of resources that were produced in response to the disaster. And the films in particular helped us to put ourselves in the shoes of family members. There isn't time today to go into detail about the design, but one key element is the memorial pavilion, and that evolved in response to empathising with how family members continued to communicate with their dead men. This included one of the dead men's mothers describing how she hammered a rock on one of the coal slurry pipes that we see here that took the coal out of the mine in a slurry system. She wanted the men to hear the sound as it travelled into the mine and to know that they were outside. She describes wanting to scream into the mine. The annual commemorations of the disaster held at the mine, family members shout the names of their loved ones into the portal, so that's the portal of the mine there. And the family members spoke of their hopes that others visiting the mine will also shout the names into the void. So the design needed to support that. In 2011, a mines rescue team entered the mine as part of sealing it off because of issues with gases. And despite it being some 4 months after the explosion, so the men were very much dead at this point, they also communicated with the men, writing them a note that concluded with, "We will return, kia kaha," which means be strong. The portal emerged as the key point for the memorial because of this ongoing communication. That's where it all happened. And rather than the mine plunging into the ground at this point, which is how we often imagine mines, it actually goes slowly uphill following the coal seam. So we extruded the mine into the open air, so there's the portal seen from above, so that communication lines could be kept clear and open, placing a pavilion at that point. The pavilion echoes the form of the protective mine sets that shelter the ventilation system, and it uses the principle of parallax, the way that the fins are set up, to create an experience of focusing on the mine and the men in one direction. And if you stand at the portal and look backwards, you can connect with the lush west coast rainforest in the background, the rain, the bush, the White Night Stream, which is just behind that little wall. And you can read the names of the men, and it provides an ideal setting for melancholy and reflection. The second example is the Christchurch earthquake in 2011, which is part of a much longer sequence of earthquakes, but the one on this day killed 185 people. And the image in the background here is of Oimanua, the Canterbury Earthquakes National Memorial, which lists the names of those who lost their lives. And when you look at the wall, you can see groups of names that are subtly gathered together. It isn't labelled why they are grouped together. We followed the approach of grouping names as meaningful adjacencies, which was a strategy developed at the 9/11 Memorial in New York. And there's one particular group of names that represents the losses in one of the buildings, the CTV building, this one here, which amongst other things housed a language school with tutors and students from all over the world. Together with the PGC building, these are the sensitive sites where most lives were lost. So empathising brought multiple challenges of translation back and forth, the distant locations of the loved ones around the world, and as in any traumatic situation, knowing when is the right time to undertake this phase. In terms of the overall timing of the earthquake memorial responses in Christchurch, there were again criticisms that it was too early and that it was too late. Conversations in general began in the year following the earthquakes, but the sensitive sites didn't become a focus until about 3 years later, after the city had been removed from the cordon. We were able to hold some empathising workshops with locally based family members. And as with the Pike River workshops, these were emotionally very fraught, and we were fortunate to have the Red Cross support the workshop sessions. The ongoing work allowed for the identification of strategies for the two sites to respond to the need to protect these landscapes and what was left of the buildings, which was really only the foundations and car parks. Everything else had been cleared away. So we needed to augment our empathising again through looking at how people were responding to the sites and again putting ourselves in the shoes of these users. As designers, we had to put aside what can sometimes be an over-attention to aesthetics and to respond directly what people wanted, even if it was not beautiful in conventional terms. The tribute fence that we see here in version 1.0 became significant, as with many sites of tragedy. We drew on the experience of other sites around the world and developed protocols for caring for the tributes to reassure people that the sites were being cared for, that the mementos were being removed and archived, or composted in the case of organic materials. Once the perimeter fence was removed, a temporary landscape was installed, and this included a kind of surrogate of the tribute fence to allow for mementos to continue to be left. So this was version 2.0. The tribute wall eventually became a steel structure with a stone base with an inscription that refers to remembering those who lost their lives at this site. It honoured the rituals of visiting and leaving tributes that had developed from locals to international visitors from the wide range of cultural groups. The image on the right is from a Japanese newspaper, which was reporting on loved ones heading to Christchurch to remember those they lost. Empathising through the proxy of behavioural traces, as with the tribute fence, was also true of developing an understanding about people's propensity to stand on the site of loss. This poignant image shows flowers and tributes placed at CTV while it was still surrounded by a fence. These flowers had been placed there by authorities who were caring for the site, taking them from where they had been left at the fence in huge numbers and moving them onto the building foundations. This was a prompt for thinking about the polarised views that people had about standing on the site, and we developed a response of delineation. Some people really wanted to stand on the site, and some people definitely did not want to stand on it. And there are parallels with this in cemeteries, where visitors can be very uncomfortable with standing on graves or other sites such as scattering lawns. So it's very important to be aware of thresholds. So this is just a brief overview of a couple of sites where the sacredness of the site, of the landscapes, because of what happened there, is recognised through empathising. Because of the challenging circumstances of survivors and families, the demanding process of workshops that would often be used for empathising was augmented by other resources and behavioural traces, which provided a basis for defining and ideating. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks.
Jackie, that was wonderful. And one thing I captured was paying too much attention to aesthetics. That's something that I fall victim to often. And we have to remind ourselves to think about who's using this space and who we really need to pay attention to. That was incredible. Thank you so much. I believe our next presenter is Diane.
Let's see. Okay. And let's see. Okay, so hi, I'm Diane Jones-Allen. I'm Director of Landscape Architecture at UTA, which is in Texas and USA. And I'm also Principal Landscape Architect of Design Jones. And I'm gonna talk about two projects, so I'm gonna like slide really quickly till I get to the first two. So just ignore everything you're seeing. What's a better way to do this? Okay. Okay. So I feel as a landscape architect that landscape architecture is a way to heal. And there are many kinds of, as we just saw, which was amazing presentation and how you dealt with that. There are many kinds of wounds. And this first project is the Tamir Rice Memorial. So I don't know if you know about Tamir Rice. In 2014, a 12-year-old African-American child was in a park, believe it or not, in front of his school. Actually, he was in front of his school. And he was shot dead on site by police. And the picture's blurry because, but that circle is, you could see, is Tamir. And you could see the policeman and in the car. I was asked, my firm, to work with his mother, who actually, the policeman was not charged. She just received a civil suit. And of course, she was very upset. And this is the site. And when I saw this on the news in 2014, which was many years earlier before we got this commission, it was shot up close. And there was a pavilion, that concrete is where the pavilion was, where he was sitting. And he was playing with a toy gun, and there's a neighborhood, you could see their houses, and someone called the police and said, there's a young black man. He was 12, but he was kind of tall. There's a young black man playing with a gun, although it could be a toy gun. And that's how that happened, people calling from outside. But anyway, when I went there, I was shocked because from what I had seen in 2014, I didn't really realize where he was. And he was on a site with a school where he should have been. And actually, his sister was there. She watched him get shot and she watched him die. And so the thing is, it's really hard to deal with a site like this. The mother who was paying for this, the city gave her an encroachment agreement that allowed her to use the site because it's public site. But first she tore the pavilion down, and it's in Chicago, but then she said, I do want something there. But she got a permission from the lynching museum in Alabama. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's a place you should go. But anyway, so there are these hanging pillars. That design was done by, I'm trying to think of the firm, but anyway, so she got permission to copyright one of those hanging pillars, which have the names of each pillar is a county, and it has the names of people that were lynched. So she wanted to put her son's name on one of those hanging pillars and hang it on the site. So, they felt like they needed a landscape architect to help her. But I told her no, especially after I saw the site. I didn't tell her no. I worked with her to convince her that that was not what she should do. But I understood her point because she felt that it was a lynching. And I totally agree. She felt that what happened to her son was a lynching. And so she wanted to, really bring that home. But I explained to her that it all should be a site of healing, but it should not deny what happened to her son. So she agreed. She said, okay, come up with some ideas. And if I don't like them, we're going back to what I think should happen here. So I came up with these two ideas. One was about the fact that African-American boys are put in a box. They're really butterflies that are put in a box, or they're, in a box when they're alive. We put them in these boxes, and, they're really butterflies. And then I had another scheme where the same thing, the idea of the butterfly. There was already a butterfly garden on the site. We redesigned it, but it was done by his sister's school. That elementary school put that butterfly garden there, not in remembrance of for Tamir, but for his sister who suffered trauma. She was thrown down on the ground and held while he died. So her school put that there for her. And I thought it was a really, we shouldn't lose that. So this one was about, kind of a morphing and then a cutting off. But his mother liked this one. So the idea of the butterfly in the box. Oops. And it went through a lot of iterations. We also realized that in a park, we started thinking about like healing of the landscape, but also the trauma, the box is the trauma, right? And then, how do you heal from this? And this is a place where children and families come. So we looked at doing a dry creek. So actually water would run off and run into this reconstituted butterfly garden. Okay. So this was the memorial that was held. And of course, the mother, when she saw like what we came up with, and initially she was all for it. She realized that it should be a place of healing so that her family and people in the community could come to, but she wanted us to realize that it was still a place of horror and trauma. And there's a plaque in the middle of the butterfly, which is dedicated to Taji, which is the sister. He was 12, she was 8. The 8-year-old who was held on the ground, that plaque is for there. And then we had a local artist actually do these small butterflies to put in there. And then here's some pictures. So you can see it's a place where, and that was my idea about like, this has to be a place that does both. And these are young men that were, well, actually, these are young men that were about his age when he died at 12. And then these are young men who are about the age, he would be about 20 now, I guess 2014, or maybe it'd be like 24, if I'm counting right. And we went back and forth with the city about the text because, I had his mother write the text and she basically wanted to say, about the everlasting pain that they cause and that they cause Black America. And of course, the city, I had to kind of go back and forth to get them to realize that, she should be able to speak that. And because of the setting, they were like, okay, she should be able to say, about, police brutality and what happened there. So even though it's like kind of a passive place with a butterfly garden, once you're in that space and you're around, the granite plaque, and you read the words and you know what happened to the sister, it is still a place of trauma. So the next project I'm going to talk about briefly is the Fred Rouse Memorial. It's kind of the same thing. This tree, they're in not the same thing, but another trauma that happened. But it happened in 1921. Fred Rouse was worked at a butcher company in Fort Worth, Texas, and white union workers were having a strike. And if you were African American, you couldn't belong to the union. So he went to work. But they were upset that he went to work because, of course, they felt like he was busting the union for which he would get no benefits for. So he felt like, well, since I don't get any benefits, I'm going to go work. So they hung him. Well, they didn't hang him. He actually was abducted and beaten. And in this case, actually, the police were kind of the heroes. The police came and told the crowd that basically he was dead. And then they took him to the hospital. And basically at the hospital, someone told that he was not dead. And the doctors basically turned him over to the police and he was hung at this tree. So it's the case of this, and this is his Fred Rouse III. This was his grandson who now works with the Tarrant County Peace and Justice Coalition, who are actually doing this. And he actually didn't know that this had happened because his parents never would talk about his grandfather, whom he was named after. And somebody who had done this history called him up, and that's how he found out about it. And so, you know, he worked with this group to put together this memorial. Actually, right now we're just in, we're actually, it's going to go, the ground's going to be broken. Well, we had a groundbreaking, but actually construction, it's going to start December is when it's going to go to bid. So I'm just going to show you renderings. So basically this is the site, and that plaque, Fred Rouse's name is actually in the lynching memorial in Alabama. His name hangs on one of those pillars. But the site is in kind of an area that's starting to gentrify, right? It was industrial, and now they're building condos and apartments, and it's starting to change. And so they were able to get a slither of this, a piece, but now the city has given them the other piece that they need, which is really great. But of course, our design was guided by Fred Rouse, the Justice Coalition, and the community. So we did engagement to actually find out like what would they want to really happen here. And then these were concept sketches. And this was the final design. And an interesting about this design is the 14 that you see there in the middle, that came from the community. Because when we had the groundbreaking, the community had a healing, a ground healing. So we decided we would keep that space so that they could come and actually, you know, still do things and have rituals there and plant it. Or each community is supposed to get one of those, a replica of the hanging piece, where they could put that there. But and just briefly, these are the two long areas are rain gardens. I mean, designs more if they were fountains, but thinking about sustainability of this kind of land, they became rain gardens there that go along. And then there's a plaque, and where number 13 is the lynching tree, and then a healing garden. So the same thing, we wanted to make a place that doesn't deny what happened here, right? That there was, you know, a terrible trauma that happened on this landscape, but, you know, and that justice should be had, but there's perseverance, and that there's reckoning. And so we did these corten panels that go along with that rain garden that actually is going to have, you know, cells that capture the water, and then it kind of gets recirculated. It only connects to the city system, you know, for overflow. But this is a night. And then this is Fred Rouse. And the quote on there is from his son. I wasn't there that night with my grandfather when my grandfather was murdered, but the man of faith that I am leads me to believe that as Fred Rouse was taking his last breath, he prayed and he whispered into the universe that this only the beginning. And I believe at the moment a transformation began to happen. And so this was we came to a groundbreaking, and a community group was doing this healing ceremony where, you know, people were given jars of soil to take home, and then they'll bring them back, and a prayer was sent. So you can see on this side, we kept that space in the design. And that's another quote from the grandson. And then a timeline of like what I just showed you, we're actually putting that on the wall so people understand what happened there, the attack, the abduction, the turning over by the hospital, and then the ultimate death in the tree. Yeah, and this was that same groundbreaking, and then participating in the healing ceremony. Okay, thank you.
Diane, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Our last presentation, I believe, is from Lila.
Did I unshare?
Yes.
Okay.
Diane, if you could just unshare your screen, please.
Okay, so do it. Did it do it? Yes.
Yep, perfect.
Hello, everybody. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep,
Yeah,
you're
that's
perfect.
Great. Welcome to my presentation on landscapes of memory. I've been working with LEES+Associates landscape architecture and planning firm designing cemeteries and memorials for nearly 2 decades. And my work over the years has included designing landscapes for forgotten and marginalized people. So today I'm going to talk briefly about 3 cemetery and memorial projects. The first one being a Quw'utsun Nation cemetery restoration, which addresses indigeneity. The second one, looking at the Komagata-Maru Memorial, which addresses race, and then finishing with the Ohio Health Perinatal Garden, which addresses gender. So the common theme that runs through all of these projects is really the importance of how the narrative is told and experienced through composition and materials that engage the senses and ultimately inspire insight and compassion. So beginning with the Quw'utsun First Nation cemetery restoration. So this cemetery is about 45 minutes from Vancouver, just near the Quw'utsun River. And the site consistently floods due to the impacts of damming and various uses upstream. So our task was to restore an important Indigenous cemetery that's been neglected and is in an area that now experiences annual flooding. So we spent a lot of time working with the community, and what we heard from the community was that we needed to redefine the boundary of the cemetery in order to incorporate newly discovered or excluded burial remains. And the site's flooded for many years due to the damming of the river further upstream. So we needed to create a robust and resilient landscape that could withstand the flooding, as well as to have elements that will allow the community to commemorate their ancestors and ultimately reclaim their cemetery. So establishing trust has been a really key aspect of the project. And through a lot of conversation, what we learned is that the community really wanted to take a much more holistic approach to the whole project and the watershed. We discovered, as we continue to learn from Indigenous clients, that it takes time to build relationships and trust. So a big challenge was site access. So they didn't want us to step onto the cemetery land as it's sacred ground. So as designers, we're faced with this challenge of how do we design spaces when we don't have access? But after nearly a year of working with the community and engaging through public open houses, site visits, workshops, meetings, we were allowed and invited to walk the land. So the first phase of work was to create a site boundary or a fence that would ultimately delineate and give reverence to the site, to be surface mounted so it wouldn't disturb the archaeology and could withstand flooding, and to incorporate those people that were left outside the fence line when the Catholic Church put a fence around the cemetery. And finally, to provide a movable boundary that can incorporate remains as community members come forward or old graves continue to be discovered. So the first phase of this humble fence construction using split rail cedar is now complete, and a multi-phase landscape restoration project to restore the watershed as well as important ceremonial aspects of the cemetery lies ahead as cultural funding is provided. The next project I'll touch on is the Komagata-Maru Memorial, a very different project. So this is a federally funded project to commemorate an infamous incident in 1914 when the Canadian government denied entry to Indian migrants who came into the port aboard the Komagata-Maru ship. And due to the continuous passage order and other discriminatory immigration laws of the time, Indian passengers were not permitted to land. So 96 years after the tragedy and 65 years after the repeal of the unjust legislation, the government of Canada was ready to recognize the injustice and publicly apologize for its actions. So our task was the site selection and design of the memorial, and to lead the public engagement process and achieve consensus on a design for this highly controversial monument and its placement in a visually prominent location on Vancouver's waterfront. So the design objectives for this project were to create a place that evoked the magnitude of the incident while respecting its context, and to design a memorial that could both take advantage of the site's highly programmed surroundings while creating a place of contemplation, compassion, and gathering in this underutilized sort of corner of Vancouver's active waterfront. So working closely with the team, we helped to select the location for the memorial, and it looked towards the spot that the steamship lay anchor 1 kilometer offshore. And the main design elements included weathered steel panels, waves of planting, and a cast glass panel that contains the narrative. So we worked closely with the federal government, Vancouver Parks Board, and the Chalcedonian Society. And many of the conversations were centered on how we could tell the story by creating a less literal interpretation of the ship. For the design team, it seemed that the message was really about transparency. So central to the Memorial Plaza, the steel panels perfectly framed the view to where the ship was moored, so creating a physical and metaphorical connection. And a glass panel with almost ghostly historic image of some of the ill-fated passengers adds depth and historic humanity to the design. And the panels feature laser cut names of the 376 passengers, and they're illuminated with a LED lighting. So at night, the panels themselves become a canvas for reflection and activate the waterfront park after dark. And on the ground plane, plank-sized pieces of chiseled bluestone evoke the steamship's wooden decking. And perforations in the steel are animated by light and shadow, suggesting new perspectives and a new transparency about the past. So I'll move on to the final project, which is with Ohio Health. It's a perinatal memorial garden in Columbus, Ohio. So Ohio Health recognized that the state of Ohio does not have a place where cremated remains of preterm babies and stillbirths can be buried and remembered. So we were called upon to create a respectful space where mothers and families that lose their babies can be commemorated and remembered, and to provide a place where cremated remains for babies can be interred and kept safe. So what we heard from the mothers and the families who had lost their infants was that there was a real sense of loss and almost shame. And what they really wanted was a place that assured them that their baby would not be forgotten, a place that families can go and see that they're not alone, a place that was inclusive and equitable and welcoming to all backgrounds, and ultimately a place that they felt you could be safe and be seen. So in response, we knew we needed to create a gentle, safe space that held families and allowed them to reflect, gather, and celebrate the seasons. So central to the pollinator garden and the design, a ribbon wall runs through the site. It's a dry stack stone wall that is a container of memories, both literally and figuratively. And the ribbon wall allows cremated remains, stories, and memories to be woven into a collective band or wall that runs through the site. And the idea is that the columbaria are actually inspired by wall bees. So their steel or aluminum cylinders hold the cremated remains, and then cast glass or resin plugs form the seals for those. And like gems, each seal is a shade of amber or golden glass, evocative of rays of sunshine or stars. And these remains have a preciousness to them, almost like sacred jewels. But it's not so much about the individual commemoration as much as the collective honeycomb composition that's created. But what I have learned working in cemeteries over the last 20 years is that humans have a real need for personal commemoration. But commemorative things that continue to be added to a landscape can often cause the space to be too cluttered, and it no longer provides a contemplative space for reflection. So rather than have the inscription on the wall, a dry riverbed runs through the perennial garden, and each infant is commemorated with a stone in the dry riverbed, and space allows for inscription of the baby's name and date, and adjacent planting offers a rich diversity of perennials that attract bees and butterflies. So I've just touched on a few projects, but I want to close with a common thread that runs through all of these, and that is weaving the memorial landscape and creating sacred spaces depends on our ability to evoke and engage the senses and ultimately inspire compassion. And I'll leave you with this quote by Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much. All of these have been incredible, and I have so many questions buzzing around in my head. I'm immediately going to go off piece and ask one that is not on my list of questions, but I believe maybe is a combination of a couple. The first thing that came to my mind when I was listening to you all talk is one thing I'm trying to focus on for myself is cultural competency in death care without requiring anyone to educate me. It's my responsibility to educate myself, right? So when you're creating a sacred landscape like you are for Tamir's mom or for the mining disaster, how do you go about merging together this memorial for these individual people or persons whilst also having a space that educates?
Go first, if you like.
Sure.
The experience that we had at the mining disaster was that the families and everyone involved were quite keen for education to be part of the response. So there wasn't a real tension there between the two things. So part of that was, that term narrative has been mentioned, sort of like thinking about the narrative, the storytelling about the site. And there's a much wider part of the site that does that. And interestingly, in the context of cultural competency, there is an Indigenous narrative that underlies the predates by many centuries, the mining disaster, but that was a narrative not to be told. The local Māori were very specific about that. That's kind of like an invisible sacred story. So it's often sort of finding the balance, I think, between those different narratives as well, not exposing things that shouldn't be exposed, but also finding that educational component without being too teachery about it, which is, is kind of, you can slip into that overdoing it in terms of design sometimes too, that everything has got a message and so on, and people don't have any capacity to find things out themselves.
I'll add that I think that when people experience trauma, like, in the case of Tamir Rice or even Fred Rouse's grandson, that they want people to know. I mean, they want people to know. Mm-hmm. And I think, and I also think like the key, so in the case with Tamir's mom, who actually came with this idea, was really for me to hear, right? Not just to listen, but to hear like what it was. So it was that she was really, it wasn't really much that she wanted that piece from the, from the other memorial. She wanted people to know that it was a lynching. She wanted people to know what happened to her kids. So actually she told me, after, being there at the memorial and seeing the design, although, she saw it at all the phases where we were drawing and designing. She told me that, yeah, we did that. What she would have done wouldn't have told the whole story. Like it wouldn't have told about the daughter laying there. It wouldn't have, and she said she really didn't know that she could get that story out of that site. So just to answer, like, in these cases, often it's easy to educate because they want people to know what happened.
Wow. One other question that came to me, and it is on the list, and when Jackie, you were talking about how the mom, I think, would bang the rock on the pipe. It's like a sensory thing, and I'm a very sensory person when it comes to going to cemeteries or sacred places. I like to touch, I like to feel. I recently went to the 9/11 memorial, and the first thing I did is run my hands along those names. So there is that desire for a lot of us to participate in the space. So how do you design sacred landscapes that encourage active participation?
I can start off. I think there certainly are using materials that invite people to engage, and materials that have both temporal qualities and qualities that, for example, stone, that invites you to run your hands over names, and it's a material that changes over time. And again, even so much as, where people have run their hands, that becomes part of the story and the place. So I think in the same way with planting and seasonal plants that have different kind of auditory qualities, I think that's a really, really key, is using and being able to use materials that engage all of the senses really adds to the richness of the experience.
Yes, and I would add to that too, the use of water is really important. It's not always that easy to do because water features can be notoriously very hard to look after, and there's nothing sadder than seeing a water feature that's not being cared for. And we were lucky in the case of the earthquake memorial that I just showed briefly, in choosing a site. We actually chose the site by the river, which is a natural water feature. It's always there, and it also evokes all those things. Smell is the strongest sense in terms of memory. So being down by the river in that kind of wet, I guess slightly mournful kind of setting with the willows hanging and like that, it is very evocative and atmospheric, and a lot of that comes from senses far beyond the visual. We rely so much on the visual, but all those other senses, yes, the touching and smelling and hearing and all those sorts of things are really significant, I think, for that kind of transformation that needs to happen when you go onto a sacred site.
Yeah, I think like making, for instance, in the Fred Rouse site, and we didn't plan that. That happened when we saw that the ritual that they performed. I think making places within the site, especially that they can add to, like sites aren't really finished anyway until people are using them, but, actually planning for a place like we left that one space where they can come in and finish. I really love Layla's project with the stones. I just think, I said, oh, I'm going to steal that one. I love that idea, of them being able to be actively and finish the site by putting those names and the stones in the river. I just thought that was amazing. So I think, doing things like that where people can finish and add to it.
Wonderful. So when we are discussing sensitive spaces, sensitive, like traumatic events, do you have any tips for conducting community engagement when discussing those traumatic events and spaces?
My main one would be to get a really good facilitator. That was transformational in both of the key processes that I've been involved with, because as landscape architects, we're not trained to do that. We think we can do everything, but actually we can't. And the facilitator, particularly one we had for Pike River, just had an amazing skill in terms of, compassion, empathizing, putting people in a safe place that they felt that they could share. And that was really important. That was his role, and that allowed us to focus more on the things that we were doing rather than trying to do everything that is off. And it is an extra cost, of course, if we're thinking about how to resource some of these projects, but it's totally invaluable in terms of making it work.
I think with any project or any engagement, I always believe that the organizing pre-engagement, because I've seen engagements go totally wrong, nobody shows up, it doesn't, because there was no organizing before. And I think in cases like this, the organizing is really important and kind of different. It's not the same as, you're trying to get everybody to come. So the organizing is who should come, like who should be there. And like just was said, where should it really happen, right? So I think the pre-work and you understanding, who these people are, what they've been through, meeting with them before you bring a bunch of people together in whatever place that is. I think the pre-work is really, really important. In the case of Tamir Rice, it was basically her mother and family, right? Because they felt that it was kind of personal, even though we had to do things with the city and go through. But in the case of Rouse, it was much different. They wanted the whole community to participate. So I think it's the pre-work is really important to organize. And often we do engagement without organizing.
Have you had any situations where there was too many voices? How do you handle too many voices, too many cooks in the kitchen?
Yeah, I think one of the things about it from a co-design perspective, where you are trying to involve everyone, is just recognizing you're never going to get consensus, which is an important part of that kind of process. That you could be there talking for weeks and you're never going to make everyone happy. So one of the main things we've always kept in mind is it's like the first do no harm thing. Just make sure that no one's damaged by it. If they don't like it, it doesn't really matter. That's not the end of the world. Everyone isn't going to be happy with the outcome. But how do you negotiate it in a way that people are kind of accepting of it? That's kind of like the bottom line. Some people will love it. And I think that's where some processes can get a bit unstuck. They want everyone to agree. Unlikely that they'll ever happen, I think, for design.
That's so important because communities are never a monolith. I always, people say the community or the users. Well, it's there. I mean, like was just said, they're not a monolith. So it's, important, that you hear all the voices, but realize they're going to say different things. And sometimes, you have to make the consensus within yourself. Yeah. But not going in thinking that this is the community, or that you have people, even when you have one group, they have varying opinions about how things should happen. It's about hearing them all and then figuring that out.
And also just finding a balance, because there are often multiple narratives, but there's ways that multiple narratives can be incorporated into a site as well. In some cases more subtle, than your key information panel, but then there are other ways to address these other kind of needs and opinions and narratives.
That kind of leads into another question that I was looking at, which is, how do you approach the design of sacred landscapes in locations with multiple overlapping histories? I was recently just in New Orleans and learning about kind of remembrance sites for Katrina memorials that are on historically native lands. It was very interesting to see how they had kind of merged the two. So what are your thoughts on sites that have multiple histories?
I think, that's a really good point to bring up in conversation, because almost all land has multiple histories. And I know, especially in the United States, we tend to say, like, this is the, this is the important history. But most sites, most neighborhoods do. Like, different people lived here at different times. And of course, the whole country was like that, right? We had, the indigenous that were here, and then, Europeans, and then Africans were brought in, and then other European, so I think it is acknowledging, which often is hard for us to do, that any piece of land has multiple histories and that they're all important. But, for what purpose, are we designing, and and how do we still do it? Like, and also reflect that there are multiple histories that are there.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of a change of mindset that certainly happened in New Zealand, is, a move from having a very imposed colonial narrative to that recognition, as you say, that there are multiple narratives. So it's a rethinking of how you enter a site and how you engage with it, and being sure that you don't erase anything as you go, which has happened so much in the past.
Perfect. I thought about, I think, Diane, it was in one of your creations. It was in a neighborhood that was gentrifying. So you're going from an industrial space to now, something with more apartments and homes. How do we go about making sure we don't lose these sacred spaces to something like gentrification?
I'll just start with that. That's a bigger issue, right? That's a basic issue about how we view land. Like, especially, to pick on the United States, but it's what I know. And I'm in Texas, where any vacant land, any vacant land must be developed. It's useless if it's just sitting there, right? And we as landscape architects know that it's not, right? There's evapotranspiration, and it's collecting water.
Oop, did we freeze, Diane? Did everybody else lose Diane as well?
Yes, yeah, we
Yeah,
might
looks
just
Okay.
have to wait
dropped
until
off.
someone-
Okay.
I can add something there in terms of protecting those sites, if you like. We wait for Diane to reappear.
Sure.
Because that's one thing that happened in the aftermath of the earthquakes and so on, was that sense that all empty sites were latent sites for development, kind of what Diane was talking about there, that's kind of the main assumption. And part of the reason for protecting those two sites that I was talking about, CTV and PGC, of putting something on them kind of like a resistance to everything else happening before there was any suggestion that something would be built there again, because people felt so strongly about the sacredness of those sites that it would be so inappropriate for something else to happen. So yeah, kind of an act of resistance, I guess, by putting things on there and in a way heightening the metaphysical components, the spiritual components of that site, kind of not exactly haunt them, but give a sense that there is a lot of presences there, even if you can't see them, and that it would be a very bad thing to do for something else to be built there.
Yeah.
Sorry, I went away. But anyway, I was going to say, and I think from what I just heard, I think it was kind of the same thing, that I had a project where I was going to show that where I think we over design. Like, I think we put too much, because I think there is something, that's codes of memory, that people don't always need you to be totally literal and totally fill up even a sacred space and meet. So, because I think they have these codes of memory and this, like, this kind of spiritual thing. So it is kind of like creating a balance and knowing, how much.
Yeah, I can totally see how you could over-engineer, I think is the word we use often at Return Home. You just create more than you needed to when you should be like allowing our imagination and our connection to the site to create its own thing. I liked how Lila had the boat that wasn't quite a boat. That was like a beautiful step back from what my brain immediately wanted to put there, right? So at Return Home, we're turning people into soil. We're creating something that's useful, that could be used in sacred spaces. Do you see any trends where kind of new dispositions may be coming into the creation of different types of sacred spaces?
I would say definitely we're at a real turning point in terms of people looking to ecology and limited land, and how we deal with bodies and interment across the board. So I think we're looking at a whole new paradigm around what cemeteries might and will look like. So I would say we're certainly in a new period where certainly green burial, as we know, is very much on the rise. And again, that's a shifting of people being focused on the individual and the location of the individual interment, and a real shift to the collective, so that you are not just in that location, but you are part of this grove, this meadow, this forest. So I think we're in real shifting sands in terms of the future of what cemeteries look like.
And I would say that even goes for other kinds of memorials for, traumatic events, that kind of Jackie and I showed. And, I think that other kind of memorials, there was the period when monuments or memorials were like some object. And then, thanks to Maya Lin, everyone started doing walls everywhere. And now I think we're shifting away from that. And I think things are starting to be more, natural, or natural, it's not, more in tune with the earth and the space, like utilizing the landscape. I'm working on a project right now called the Liberation Labyrinth. It's a monuments lab project. And it's in Vacherie, Louisiana. And basically, for their memorial to the slaves that lived on this site, they want a labyrinth. They want us to use the earth to do it. So I think that in terms of other kinds of memorials, the design and design thinking is shifting more to utilizing, not just like what Maya Lin did was, it was amazing, right? She put something in the landscape, right? And use grading, right? So it's like even pushing that more without even the wall. Like, how do you use the landscape that's there?
Yeah, and I think this sense that there is this paradigm shift now. I remember that there was a quite radical project in Christchurch back in the 1980s, which was to remove all headstones in a cemetery and have just a complete green space there that could be used for other purposes. And they went ahead and did it. And if people wanted to find their loved one, there was this complicated thing with a grid and a number and a metal detector and all these kinds of things. And it just didn't work. After a few years, there was these like really poignant images of these flowers kind of floating out in the middle of the lawn because someone had tried to find, so that thing about the individual was still quite present then. So they gave up on it in the end, and it's still there as this kind of experimental area of the cemetery, but next to it is they returned to the more conventional headstones and so on. But that's decades have passed since that time. So yeah, as the other two have said, this is a time of much more embracing of the collective, embracing of ecology and process in different kind of aesthetics, all those sorts of things that are really coming together to allow something quite different to happen.
As you see us embracing that kind of return to nature more, whether it by, our comfort around spaces of traumatic events or death in general, or by force. For example, during COVID, a lot of us found that, we can walk in cemeteries. They're very open spaces where we can maybe wouldn't have gone before, but now we're kind of forced into these spaces, but actually they're wonderful. Do you feel that sacred landscapes should be integrated into everyday spaces or kept separate as their own environments?
I strongly feel they should be integrated. I mean, that was my thing about Tamir Rice, is that I wanted her to know that people are still going to walk through there, and kids are going to go to school and play. And so how do we make a landscape that they can, be in, but still, tell your story? Even with Fred Rouse, we wanted that to be a place that if you live there, you could come and sit and contemplate and learn the story of Fred Rouse, or not just be in this sacred space for your own healing or pleasure. So I think they should be places that the community within which they sit can, use and participate, in a respectful, but you can design them, in a respectful kind of way. But yeah, I think they should be.
Yes, I really agree with that too, because these things happen in everyday landscapes, and that's part of what makes them so traumatic a lot of the time, is that just on an ordinary day somewhere something awful goes wrong, so that without making our lives hung about with negativity, which is not the point of what memorials are doing, but providing those spaces for reflection, just as you're passing through on your daily routes and so on. I think it's really important.
Yeah, I agree. Part of basic humanity, I think, is integrating these spaces into our everyday landscapes.
Perfect. Can you share your experience designing across different scales? For example, a plaza versus a multi-block memorial walk, something small to something large. How do you go about navigating that experience? I'm going to call on you, Lila.
Sure. I think ultimately they are made up of the same facets in a lot of ways. But certainly when you're designing a plaza, I'm just thinking, for instance, of the Komagata Maru Memorial, you're dealing with, these very close adjacencies and relationships and impacts and experiences that happen in this very small space. Whereas when you're designing a streetscape or a larger space, I think the design components are really similar, but the considerations are I'm imagining that those pieces kind of fall within the larger streetscape or the larger landscape. I suppose it's easier maybe for me to compare a cemetery landscape. In some cases, we're designing, working in a small corner to redevelop a piece of a cemetery versus looking at a whole cemetery, in which case sometimes the question is around, historically, cemeteries in North America were organized in neighborhoods. So you'd have your Jewish neighborhood, your Catholic neighborhood. And so in the same way, it's really a question of, as we're designing cemeteries now and looking at existing cemeteries, is how do we maintain those neighborhoods and add these new layers of, for instance, burials or new neighborhoods into this existing kind of structure, where now we're looking at a much more a melting pot of a neighborhood, if that makes sense. So I think our approach to cemetery spaces is to have to create new developments where there's opportunities for people who have a range of choices, so that we're not dividing people by neighborhood, but that there's kind of a sense of collective design, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have segregated so much, and then coming together again, I fear that I would do what Diane said that maybe she did in one of hers, which was over, and I'd want to put everything for everyone in one little spot. So learning to be deliberate about your choices, I think, is probably something you have to learn along the way.
And I think what we've come to in a lot of cases is the need for ceremonial or collective gathering spaces. So ultimately, that becomes what the space is about, rather than trying to meet the needs of all of these individual assets or pieces, that it really is in that collective gathering space. That's really key in terms of design moving forward. It seems central to all of our designs is a collective gathering space.
Absolutely. In your experience, what is the role of public art in sacred landscapes?
Well, I think public art is really important. I mean, in Tamir Rice, we actually had an artist put those butterfly. I mean, we could have done that, but we thought that it was more important to get an artist, somebody from the community, to do that. And they also, those like butterfly tiles, like any art does, offers a moment to kind of contemplate, see beauty. It also is kind of like a unifying piece, a place of triangulation where people might come and hover over the butterflies or the art, but or the statue, whatever you've put there. So I think it's really important because it offers several aspects, right? It's a way to get someone that often the community knows the artist if they're from, it offers, that kind of extra, contribution, but then it offers like these places of triangulation, places where people can kind of forces them, or simply they come together around these things, right? Yeah, I think it's really important.
It allows it almost to feel like ours instead of theirs, if you're bringing other people in. Yeah.
Yeah, and as we were talking before about the multiple narratives often on sites, public art's one of the best ways to allow that to find its voice as well, because the art speaks so loudly to each one of those different threads.
Okay, one more question here. This one was very interesting to me and not something I would have thought about. So how do you balance legibility, representations of events being memorialized, and abstraction?
I think that often as designers, we struggle with that. It's like I'm a professor too. And I've seen many students stand up and talk about things that are not happening in the design, right? They have given me the best story I have ever heard, but it is nowhere, or I just don't get it, right? So I think that is a struggle. Like sometimes we're very successful at it. Like you mentioned, like Layla's boat. That was very successful. You got that meaning, you got the idea of the filtered light, and what had happened there. But sometimes we, can't quite make that. That is a struggle of good design, is trying to really the ideas that you have that. And also not that you have them, you design them, but the key is, will other people get that, right? Other people get that, because I can say all kinds of fabulous things about my design, but if somehow the form is not transmitting that, and I see a lot of that in school, but I understand. But as I tell students, that's a struggle. You can say fabulous things, but how do you get me to feel it without you telling me everything? And I think in sites like this that really are about trying to transmitting not an event or meaning and feeling, that is like, how do we get our forms to say the things that we, think they're saying? Do they really do that? Yeah.
I get told at work a lot, that's in your brain, Katie. That's in your brain. Like, oh, you don't see that too? Okay. Jackie,
Well, one of
you
the
are.
things we often use with talking to students is a theory that comes actually from literary criticism, which is called the death of the author, which is about an author writes a book and they don't stand beside you while you're reading it to tell you what to think and what to feel. So the same thing in terms of design. And to the full quote would be something like, the death of the designer is the birth of the viewer. So you have to allow your viewer or your experiencer into the site, rather than the sort of think that, no, that's not what I meant. No, you're supposed to be feeling this, and again, that sort of temptation to over design and over manipulate people's experience. So that idea of having something that is more open, finding that balance between certainty and flexibility that might happen on the site.
Can you give a little insight, Lila, into how you came about the boat, how you felt like you had reached that perfect where we could read the book without you stood next to us?
Oh, well, that was certainly a challenge because the Chalcedonian Society was very much committed to a literal interpretation of the boat. So it was very much a talking down of how can we still maintain the structure and the quality and the memory, and yet not create a replica of the boat. So it was a real back and forth between, I think the hull seemed like a really important piece. And so maintaining the structure of that, but really breaking it down, we ultimately came to a consensus that was acceptable, but not easily. Certainly, it started off as a much more literal interpretation, and much of the project was that kind of talking down and educating around what else this could be, what other kinds of meaning could be given to that. So.
Diane, do you feel like that's something you did with Tamir's mom, with not having the post from the museum? There was kind of this, not necessarily talking down, but kind of more education on how we could get her point across in a way that was different, separate from the imagery she wanted in the beginning.
Yes, I mean, because it was, she was like, it was a lynching. These are lynching memorials, and I want one. She was very, that was, so it was about me like understanding that. So like, how do I guess in the same kind of way, how do I get the idea of lynching without actually having a piece from, something hanging, right?
Mm-hmm.
And getting her to understand that we could tell much broader, more of a story. There could be more. Yeah. So I did, and basically she was like, okay, you have to show me. So I had to do those concept drawings. And then when I showed her and we walked the site, then she was like, yes. She actually was really excited because she realized that lynching, hanging that there on a pedestal, that's what she wanted to do with his name. She realized that doing that wouldn't have been able to tell the story of Taji, wouldn't be able to save the butterfly garden and when all those other things would have been left out. And that and I, and when she at the unveiling, when they unveiled, they all started crying. So she realized that, okay, because at first during the design, she kept saying, oh, it's too pretty, it doesn't remind. But when she was there on the site, it's in that stone box, and it does feel like a grave. It feels like being at a grave. So yeah, I was getting her to understand that she could get much more without just being so focused. Yeah.
Jackie, do you think was there similar kind of anger around the mining memorial of like, this was something that could have been prevented? And how did you work with that in creating what you created?
Well, it's still ongoing in terms of the anger because it's still being investigated. But yeah, it's about, in that case, sort of finding something that allows for that anger to be expressed. So, I mean, that is part of the shouting and all that kind of thing. So it doesn't, the form, again, like we were saying before, the form doesn't need to do it, but it needs to allow for it to happen. So the form isn't about shouting. The form is about providing a platform for people to express things and to have their own experiences. And I think that's the case of, a range of different memorials as well, is it's kind of making space for people to occupy it in different ways and, yeah, vent if they need to.
Yeah. The shouting into the void kind of reminds me of, it brings two things to me, right? It's that anger, letting out that emotion, but it also brings me back to like when I was a kid and I'm at the playground or something and you're playing with like the cup on the string with your friend on the other end. There's also like this loving connection to your person through that vocal too. So that's incredible. Yeah. All right, guys, we are coming up on 3:30, and I am now to tell you we are going to take a 15-minute break. Feel free to grab yourself a Coke Zero or your beverage of choice, and we will be back in 15 minutes.
Thanks, Katie.
We have got some great questions in the comments here that I'm going to go through in just a second. But I also wanted to let y'all know that you are now able to unmute yourselves to ask questions should you want to, but we ask that you use the raise hand function so that a whole bunch of you don't jump out at once, because I know you're just dying to ask those questions. So if anyone wants to raise their hand to ask a question, go ahead. If not, I will start at the top of the list. Okay, Jackie, the mine memorial looks remote. Does that impair the family's access and the greater community's experience?
That's a good question. I mean, the mine is where the mine is. It's why, and it is, we were talking before about everyday landscapes. It is an everyday landscape. It's an industrial landscape. There was, a place of mining. It is relatively easy to get to, although it's a bit of a drive. And one of the amazing things about it is that it is such an intense natural landscape as well in terms of the setting. It's in this rainforest, which is constantly dripping and very misty often and so on. So that sense of having gone somewhere that's really quite different is a powerful part of it, without doing anything at all. And it's kind of on a bit of a tourist route, not directly on it because it's down a long dead end, unfortunate word, road to get to it, but it's not sort of extremely difficult to get to.
Wonderful. A question here from Rebecca Peckham. This is, like I said, I just got back from New Orleans, and this was a heavy topic down there that memorials can become a target for graffiti and other unwanted community contributions. What aspects of design can dissuade defacement? Do you find that things like storytelling and mural art lessen unwanted public defacement?
I can answer that. Okay. Oh, so I think one of the best preventions is including the community in the design, making them the stewards, right? Usually that happens when you don't have engagement or you don't have good engagement or you don't make the community feel like, this is in your community and it's yours. In the case of Tamir Rice, like the community takes care of the butterfly garden. I was just there a few days ago because I was there for something else. And I said, let me go and see how that place is doing. And so I think when people do graffiti, it means that, they don't care about it. They don't think it's valuable or they don't understand. So I not to blame the designers, but I'm kind of blaming the designers maybe with some lack of creating stewardship, a sense of belonging, or even letting people know what it was about.
Yeah, I would really echo that as well. In the earthquake memorial, there's quite a sense of ownership among the local community to the extent that they tell other people off if they're doing the wrong thing. So I've had students down there doing kind of observations in terms of design critique, and they often report back on locals telling tourists or for not respecting the memorial and, sitting in the wrong place or, having their lunch there or something like that. So I think, again, it's that sense of ownership and care that comes from that.
And even so, it's often, sites are often impacted by vandalism despite that community engagement. For instance, the Komagata-Maru Memorial gets regularly tagged with graffiti. In that case, that material of weathered steel, it kind of works in its favor because it can be washed and then re-weathers. And of course, other materials are less forgiving than that, but it is a consideration in urban environments. Or less visited spaces can often be even more impacted. So,
was that something you took into consideration when you were thinking about the materials you were going to use?
We did, and the other item, the other piece or material on the site is the cast glass piece that contains the image of the people from the ship. And unfortunately, I think it was 2 years ago that piece was broken. And they have since replaced it with kind of a wrap situation, which it lasted, I guess, about 13 years, which isn't terrible given the context and the location. But I think that certainly maintenance is a piece of memorials in the public landscape that needs to be incorporated and understood in budgets over time. And I think that's one of the things that is we design these kind of beautiful places, but I think the conversation around maintenance is really critical and should happen more often than it does in terms of developing a program and budget and a maintenance plan.
Do you check up on your places that you've created? Like Diane, you just said you visited. Do you keep track of them?
Certainly. And we've had the Parks Board come back as well and ask us to actually come up with a maintenance plan. And some of those get followed more carefully than others, but certainly check up on them.
All right, we have a question from Sammy Miller. We've touched on this a little bit, I think. When designing or facilitating a memorial to honor a traumatic or violent event, as they typically are, is it difficult to strike a balance between honest about the horror of the event while making it digestible for public outdoor space?
Yeah, we have sort of discussed that a little bit, but the way that's phrased just reminds me of something that when I was part of the judging panel for the Canterbury Earthquake Memorial, and we had these like over 300 entries from all around the world, it was amazing how many people had proposed a memorial that wanted to relive the horror and destruction of the earthquake. And, a memorial doesn't need to do that, because we don't need to be reminded about that. We need to make space for other things to happen. And I think the same is true of a lot of traumatic events. The memorial doesn't need to rehearse that again. It needs to do something else in terms of its response to the site.
I think it also depends on the location, the site itself. For instance, in Tamir Rice, to me, that was a necessity. That was the thing I was having with her, was that it needed to do that. It needed to be, digestible by kids, because it was in front of a school in a public park where there's families across from a neighborhood, right? But some memorials, for instance, the lynching memorial in Alabama, which was done by Mass, I finally remember the name, Mass Design, it's behind walls. Like you enter into it. So there are sculptures of slaves in chains. There are, it should be that. I mean, you come out of there, impacted. But it's enclosed, right? It's not like Tamir Rice, which sits in a public park, right right in front of homes. So I think it depends on the context, and also, what you're trying to do. Because there are some cases where you want people to be horrified, but it depends on where it, the enclosure and how public is it, right? Because the lynching memorial, when you're on the street, you can't see any of that. You have to go, in to an entry, and it's walled in, right? As opposed to something, that's if it's in public space, then I do think you have to do that. You have to address that there are people every day going to be walking by this, and how do you get them to, either understand or just feel comfortable or just use the space.
Yeah, striking a balance. I went to the Holocaust Memorial in Miami, and that, from the outside, from standing on the street, it's a beautiful water feature area with some benches to sit on. And it's once you go inside that there's just horrific imagery that really is haunting. But by going inside, you're kind of giving your consent to be a part of that. Creating those two in one, I can see how that could be very difficult. Rebecca says, do sacred landscape spaces hold any historical site designations or protections?
Yes, often they do. Now, Tamir Rice, it doesn't hold a historic designation, but we had to go to the historic districts. We had to go to the Historic Districts Landmarks Commission because it was in that park, to get their permission. Often sites are, often these things happen on sites that are designated as, is historical. Like that Rouse site is historic, it's designated, and it has that blue marker that shows that. So often these, because, they're historical, it's a way also to preserve, to get funding, all kinds of things are beneficial about having a site like this designated historical, if you can do that. Yeah.
This one I find very interesting, because a lot of our families are taking their soil home to create their own sacred landscapes. Are there elements of sacred landscape design and creation that you feel citizens could take into their own backyards, plots, homes?
I've got an example to suggest here, which happened in Christchurch following mosque shootings that happened here, and 51 people were shot dead. And interestingly, a local Christian church responded with a memorial, which was 51 pairs of empty shoes, because, shoes are very significant in going into a mosque. So this was a Christian church responding to this. They gathered the shoes up from people in their congregation who had died for other reasons, they painted them all white and had them along the side of the road for a while. And then it was kind of like a moving memorial, moving in lots of ways, of course. And then the people from the congregation took the shoes home and cared for them and brought them back to the church from time to time and made these different things like, clustered them in a circle and things like that. So it's this very dynamic and quite intimate kind of thing with the shoes, and the fact that it did go into people's homes, which on one hand is quite unusual for a memorial. Then it came back into the public space again. So I don't know if it's still going, but it kept going for quite a while.
I love that.
We kind of did something like that with the soil. As you saw that healing ceremony, we put them in jars and people took them home. I actually have one. And then you put somebody, someone's name who died or someone you want to remember on the jar. We have a tag for that. But then when we start during construction, everyone's going to bring it back and put it back in that place, bring their soil back and put it back in that place in the healing area.
Katie, can I add to that?
Sure thing.
Yeah, Eric Lees here from Vancouver, colleague of Lila's. One of the things that we've learned over the years with the advent of cremation and only cremation and people taking the remains home is the lack, a number of things are lost. One is in the absence of memorialization of any kind, the community narrative is significantly compromised. A whole generation or more now since the advent of direct cremation and no memorialization has meant a giant gap in the narrative that's told, literally writ in stone in cemeteries. And that's, to my mind, a real loss. And then the other real loss, and we're seeing the pendulum swing here quite a bit, is families have no place to go to remember grandma or grandpa or friends or family. And so now there is more and more memorialization without interment in order to cast back and provide a place. And I think that's one of the reasons the infant garden that Lila showed is so powerful, because I personally witnessed older men and women of 60, 70 years old come to the counter and inquire as to whether their infant who died, the day they were born or shortly thereafter might be buried there. And sure enough, they are. And it's a very emotional experience for them. And then that stone is etched. And now there is a place that is imbued with that little person's name and the meaning and everything goes with that. And the experience of loss of a child, of course, is so powerful. So, and I'm sure you run across this all the time, Katie, in your practice, is families that have chosen cremation or chosen direct earth. Now what? Now what do we do? And unfortunately, many of our cemeteries are not quite yet as prepared as they should be to accommodate memorialization without interment.
Yeah. It's one thing I do really like about the soil transformation instead of cremation. When you have an urn, it's very easy to put in the closet and not worry about for a time. And at the end of our process, you have 250 pounds of soil. It kind of forces you to do something to make a place to put that soil. No one's putting 250 pounds of soil in the closet. So yeah, it's been a very interesting thing to watch for sure. Okay. Eric, you asked a question that I am not smart enough to read in the comments here. Do you want to read it yourself? I think you're muted.
Yeah, that was when we were, the conversation was going around the balance between literal and metaphoric. And Lila answered, I thought, quite eloquently, and we've come across this time and again. And it really goes back to we're really memorial illiterate in our society. Most people, when they think of a memorial, about all they can conjure is the idea of a brass plaque. So everything gets brass plaqued. And that was the case with the Komagata Maru. They actually had a 1/4 scale model of the ship all set to be mounted there, and we had to talk them off that cliff. But over and again, we've tried to explain to our clients that the metaphoric interpretation is so much more powerful than the literal. And I noticed in many of the examples there was a lot today, a lot of text and a lot of learning, and it was very didactic. But a few of you said, well, it's all about the experience of the place, and you may learn something. That's great. But how did you feel when you were there? What kind of emotions did it evoke? What memories came back to you while you were there or afterwards? And so I think it's those dichotomies that as both scholars and practitioners, those dichotomies are some of the most difficult to wrangle. So I guess more a statement than a question. So hence your difficulty with it.
Another from Rebecca. What unexpected additions have you come across in sacred landscaping? Flora or fauna that wasn't planned, community artistic additions, uses of the space that weren't foreseen?
Well, yeah, that happens a lot, actually. Like I said, the example I showed was we did not even know they were going to do that ceremony, and we came and they did that ceremony, and we said, okay, so that changes the space. I did another project that I didn't show where we designed an amphitheater and with steps and flat area for a stage. And when we came there on opening, they had put chairs in the flat area and they used the steps as a stage. And they thought that we designed it, but we didn't. We even had renderings where we showed people down, at the bottom of the amphitheater and the steps, but they used the steps. I guess they thought of stages should be elevated.
Lifted.
And yeah. And they were big,
Wow.
wide steps, but they were for us to sit in or on or to put movable chairs on, but they put movable chairs on the performance area and they performed on the, so often people will, and the good thing I felt was it worked, wasn't the way, and they thought that's what we designed it for because that's how they interpreted it. So often people will use things differently, and you kind of have to embrace it. Because sometimes, like with the Rouse Memorial, that was just, we thought, ingenious, right? They did the sealing ceremony, and now we have the space where we can come back and, kind of interact with the space. So, yeah, I think that often you can't look at that as a failure. I mean, like in the first example, in Rouse, we didn't look at that as a failure at all. The second example, you could have said, wow, we did, they're not using our amphitheater right, but we said, oh, they're using it, different interpretation.
Yeah. Wow. All right, next one. Sean says, given the nature of some of these traumatic events, is there any difference in design or methodology for incorporating protest or other forms of active dissonance? How do we as landscape artists incorporate that? Do we need to, or is the approach no different? I'll read the second part of this question, which is, the Pike River mine disaster maybe incorporates some of this, and maybe this is my own bias of healing and memorial spaces as quiet and contemplative and demure and inoffensive speaking. But when is anger and frustration and protest a real and meaningful aspect of space and design and memorialization?
Yeah, I think it circles around some of the things that we've discussed a little bit already about finding that balance between doing too much and doing enough to support those things to happen. And it's interesting that protest is mentioned there, because there was a lot of protests at Pike River Mine by the families because of what was happening in terms of the management and so on, that they were locking the families out. And they did this very simple gesture of taking the white lines that run down the middle of the road, the normal road markings, and just putting a line across them and turning them into crosses. And they made 29 crosses by doing that. So we actually, in our design thinking, we ended up incorporating that into the memorial. So when you're in the memorial pavilion and you look up from certain angles, you'll see a line and a horizontal, and when you're sitting in a particular place, they come together and form a cross. So it's actually building on that protest action to form something that, again, is quite quiet and contemplative. It's not in your face, but it's just like a little moment that comes into focus within the space.
I think, Diane, you talked about as well at Tamir's memorial that it's grave-like, and that its own form of confrontation of what actually happened here, without being, the lynching post that was maybe Mom's thought in the beginning. I think subtle ways like that are even more powerful to kind of someone exploring the space.
Yeah, I mean that allowed her to give her protest and voice, and people who felt that way, in this kind of peaceful way. But if you read those words, they're definitely
she said what she needed.
As landscape architects, and I had this I guess debate with another designer where they were saying that and this was after a lot of protests we had, I guess, in 2022. But anyway, here in the US. And it happens in landscapes. I mean, it happens in the, in plazas and, and so her argument was that you can't design for that those happen in those places because those places are, like she said, oh, they tend to be near the city halls, or they tend to be, but my argument was that, yeah, but they have, even though you're right, being near the city hall is like a design thing. It's a it's a thinking about where is it located, and having enough open space. So my argument was that you can design protest spaces, but her argument was that you can't design those and protests happen in spaces because of proximity and political reasons and this and that. But my argument to her back, but that is design. Yeah, good design thinks about proximity and politics and those things. But anyway, so that's
I think in my mind too, I was going a little bit to, you've created a design of a space that gets a specific emotional response from someone that might lead them to taking action against the situation that happened there in the first place. So it's, again, that emotion that you've created from your space might lead to something else in another space. It doesn't really make sense, but I know what I'm trying to say.
No, that does make sense. And one thing is for people to take action. Maybe not on that. Maybe they go then and, read more about what happens, or organize in their community, or do something,
Right.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Okay, good. The next question is, where does funding come from?
I think it depends on the project. Certainly, a couple of the projects that I've worked on, the Air India Memorial, Komagata Maru Memorial, was federal funding. And in other cases, cultural funding coming from communities to restore sacred spaces or aspects of their cemeteries or burial grounds. So I think there's a range of funding depending on the project.
I think, with these projects, you do have to have patience often because of that, because often some of the design is often done to raise funding often communities are getting grants or getting donations. Rouse was like that. That was a nonprofit that was raising every penny, except the city actually gave them an additional lot, which was great after they saw the design. But so it often takes time, and often they're using our work to raise money sometimes for the design. And then in some cases, though, the money comes from private, like in Tamir West, the land was provided by the city, but the funding for the project was private. So it's often a combination, but I do think as designers, that these kind of projects kind of happen at a different pace, depending on the funding, or depending on where you come into it. Are you coming to help them fundraise to do it through, coming up with designs, or, at the end after they have their funds? But it comes, different ways.
All right, this question is a long one. I consider the gentle practice poetry of the stones, signifying each infant in Lila's prenatal garden, or the powerful embodied practice of shouting into the void at Jackie's Mine Memorial as meaningful participatory landscape rituals. Have you found room to make more typical practices inherent in built landscapes, maintenance, construction, and/or project phasing to be likewise consistent with the cultural intent of the built work, as they are intrinsically part of the narrative of the memorial itself, or are there particular reasons why these elements should not be performative? I consider Nigel Dunnett's spontaneous planting plans as a possible precedent, for instance.
I could respond to that. Oh, you go. Oh. I would just mention, not in the context of the mine memorial, but the sensitive sites. One of the things that came out as a strategy for responding to the sites was allowing for spontaneous vegetation, just looking at the example of Nigel Dunnett's spontaneous planting plans, which is to say to allow any vegetation to take over the site, because there's quite a lot of research that shows that the acts of greening are really important in terms of therapeutic landscapes, so that nature reclaiming the site is really significant. But alongside that, it does have the tendency to look neglected because it looks weedy. So that kind of performative aspect was balanced up with putting some very clear cues. People might have heard of Joan Nassau's messy ecosystems and orderly frames. So the idea that if you have a messy ecosystem that's very healthy, people can misread it as something that's just wild and no one cares about it. But if you have an orderly frame of some sort, like a fence, or in our case, a hedge, it's actually signalling to people that it's being cared for and it's going through a process of healing itself and healing everybody else along with it.
Yeah, I was just going to say the introduction of sort of programming around annual events is certainly a way to bring that interactive piece in. For example, kind of sowing of seeds of a meadow that happens in the spring. Maybe there's seed collection that happens in another season. But it does require, in some cases, when it's less formal than what you're suggesting, Jackie, it does require kind of a programming element where that kind of annual or seasonal event could happen. But I think there are certainly rich opportunities for that.
That thought of kind of letting nature heal while we heal, Jackie, yeah, that really, I don't know, something just clicked together for me there as I'm thinking about, I grew up in England, going to maybe some of these places that are kind of being taken over again by nature. There is just this kind of like complete feeling. So I could totally get where, that done constructively can really help people heal. Yeah. One more question. What are some of the limitations of normative design processes when designing these emotionally charged landscapes? No comment. It's all good. Kristen asked that one, so you're gonna have to get your answer somewhere else, Kristen. I do see some very cute animal legs going up behind you. That's adorable. Huh. Does anybody else have any more questions for our panelists? This has been incredible. These questions have been great. Your answers have been, I'm blown away, guys. You have changed my thought processes around sacred landscapes hugely from just listening to you talk about projects that were important to you and that you've accomplished. So for me, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Any final comments from anyone?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I'll just jump right in with some closing remarks as well. I'll just echo Katie's comment that this is there's a lot to digest here. For me personally, a lot to digest, both with regard to sacred landscapes as a kind of niche practice, but also with regard to sacred landscapes as a kind of microcosm for effective design more broadly. And yeah, I'd like to just take a moment to thank our panelists, Jackie, Diane, and Lila, for their time and preparation. We would all be applauding right now had we not been on Zoom. And to also thank our MC, Katie, for her stellar facilitation and her perspectives in this conversation. I'd also like to extend thanks to everyone who was able to tune in and add their questions to this conversation today. We sincerely hope that these conversations can carry on beyond the confines of this Zoom digital platform. Please do feel free to reach out to us and carry on these conversations. And finally, just a quick parting note that a recording will be posted to the Eventbrite page from which you registered for this event, ideally by the end of today, but if not, then certainly over the weekend, should anyone wish to revisit this conversation afterwards. But with that, I'll bid you farewell, and until again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks all. Good job.